Hey everybody, so we're going to pick up where we left off here. So the last few lectures we've covered all of this material, and for the last few we've been talking about how plants acquire and transport nutrients. And in the previous lecture we talked about the use of carbon from CO2 for biosynthesis, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration, and how plants acquire the vast majority of their dry biomass from converting CO2 into the carbon in CO2 into carbon in the biomolecules that make them up. And now what we're going to talk about is how plants acquire water and other essential nutrients. So if you haven't covered these previous slides, please look at those before you proceed. So what do I mean when I talk about other essential nutrients? So if we look at this table of essential nutrients for plants, you can look at the primary, secondary, and micros. So you can think of these sort of like the macro versus micronutrients or trace elements that plants require as a function of the percentage of the plant that they make up. So you can see here things like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen make up a large percentage of overall plant biomass, nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium coming in next. And then you have these other molecules that make up a pretty small percentage of the actual plant's biomass, but nonetheless are essential for their survival. And you can see the form that the plants take up. So this is just sort of the chemical form of the element that plants will use when they actually take it up from the environment, and the mode of uptake here too. So for example, carbon dioxide or CO2 comes in through the stomata. It says mass flow for a lot of these things. That's the same thing as bulk flow that we've been talking about. And there's also something that says like root interception, but really what they're talking about here is it's just taken in through the roots. And then it talks about some of the major functions in plants, so structures, respiration, energy production, pH regulation, proteins and amino acids, cell formation, root permeability, enzyme activity, pigmentation. So I would not expect you to closely memorize all of the stuff in this table. What I do want you to pull from this is number one, that there's a lot of essential nutrients that plants require to survive. And they need to get these nutrients from their environment in different forms. And they basically pull these up using their root systems. And then they do have a bunch of major functions in plants, and I wouldn't expect you to memorize what each of these major functions is for each individual nutrient or element. But what I would expect you to understand is that ultimately each of these elements goes into the monomers that make up important polymers, and all of these important polymers act as enzymes or other essential macromolecules that are absolutely a part of essential biological reactions that plants couldn't survive without these individual elements that make up the monomers that make up important polymers. Like proteins, for example, enzymes are proteins. And so any enzymatic reaction that a plant does ultimately has to involve proteins. Ultimately, the plant has to get the individual elements from the environment that make up the amino acids that form those proteins. And you can say that about any sort of major macromolecule that's required for an essential biological reaction that a plant does. Okay, so we talked about the shoot system in plants and how the shoot system plays a really important role in collecting CO2 and light. So now let's talk about the root system and the role the root system plays in collecting water and all the other essential minerals and nutrients and transporting water and all the essential mineral nutrients that a plant needs from the soil up to the rest of the plant. So all of those other nutrients that were listed on that previous table, things like water, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, boron, so on and so forth, ultimately the plants get those from the soil, and it's the root system that pulls the water and soil out, or nutrients out of the soil. So let's talk about nutrient uptake in roots. So the root is really just an organ comprised of vascular tissue and other cells that selectively and actively uptake nutrients. So selectively meaning it only takes in things that are useful or tries its best to sort of weed out the bad stuff and only take in the good stuff. And actively means it oftentimes takes energy, or it uses energy to uptake nutrients. So it's investing energy in importing those various ions and nutrients out of the soil into the plant. And here we can see a breakdown of what a root looks like. So this is sort of the tip end of a root sliced in half long ways. And so you can see the inside of the root. It's got root hairs on the outside. It's got this sort of epidermis or outer skin. It's got this root cortex, some endodermal cells, and then it's got the vascular tissue, the phloem and the xylem too. Okay, so I wouldn't expect you to memorize all of these different sort of parts of a root, but I would expect you to sort of know what I'm referring to if I talk about root hairs or phloem or xylem. So how does this nutrient uptake work? Well, roots essentially absorb important minerals like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all of those sort of ions and minerals that we talked about previously from the soil. And the way they do that is they actually selectively import or move those minerals from the soil into the root cells using a combination of transpiration. So remember, transpiration is basically when water is getting sucked out of the stomata and the shoot system, above ground system of the plant. And then that basically acts like a straw sucking up water from the soil all the way out through the leaves. Roots also use active transport. So remember, active transport is actively, so using energy to pump ions into the root cells. And also it uses osmosis as well. Okay, so basically it looks sort of like this, where you've got these root cortex cells where you have water movement, and dissolved in the water are some solutes like nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, so on and so forth. And then those enter into the endodermal cells and into the root while passing through this Casparian strip. And that Casparian strip basically acts like a little filter to make sure that no bad stuff to keep the bad stuff out, but let the good stuff get in. So this is the selective part, where it selectively lets the good stuff in, but keeps the bad stuff out. So bad stuff being non-essential elements, things that are potentially toxic, things that could potentially be like parasites or viruses and things like that could get into the plant. And then the plant uses transpiration of water through the xylem. So remember, water travels through this xylem layer here, and it'll actually, once those good nutrients get into the xylem, it can use transpiration, which is a passive process. It doesn't require energy. It uses energy from the sun to evaporate water up in the leaves, to move that xylem through bulk flow and transport minerals to the rest of the plant. So it uses this vascular tissue and bulk flow to transport minerals to the rest of the plant. And related to structure and function, if you look at plant roots, they have all these little root hairs. So you can see this sort of cartoon version of it here. You can see the actual version here with all these little hairs coming off of that root. Why have those root hairs? What advantage do you think those root hairs have? Go ahead and write your answer in. All right, if you said to increase surface area to volume ratio for nutrient absorption, that is correct. So having all those tiny little hairs creates a really high surface area to volume ratio for the plant, and having that high surface area to volume ratio creates more surface area for nutrient absorption from the soil, absorption of nutrients and absorption of water. And you can actually make it even more efficient through cooperation to increase surface area to volume ratio. So what do I mean by cooperation? Cooperation between who? Well, cooperation between a plant and these things called mycorrhizal fungi. Okay, so almost all vascular plants, so remember vascular plants, we're talking about the ferns, the gymnosperms, the angiosperms, have a mutualistic relationship with this stuff called mycorrhizal fungi. Okay, so when we look at this diagram here, you can see the plant and the plant roots that are basically these brown parts here, and then you see all this sort of white stuff and these little hairs coming off. All those white stuff and hairs that you're looking at are hyphae of mycorrhizal fungi. So these are fungi that are connected to the roots of the plant. And when we look at vascular plants, approximately 80% of vascular plant species and 92% of vascular plant families have these associations with mycorrhizal fungi. And this association is a mutualistic relationship. So what is a mutualistic relationship? A mutualism is a symbiotic relationship. So symbiotic means a relationship where two organisms that are of different species touch and interact with each other. And the two organisms in this relationship, in a mutualism, live with each other and both benefit. So it's a positive relationship for both individuals involved in this relationship. It's a plus-plus relationship. So both of them benefit by the symbiotic relationship. That is a mutualism. And in this case, you've got these fungal hyphae, which turn out to be very, very thin relative to plant roots and plant root hairs. They can be 10 to 50 times thinner than the plant roots. So they have a very, very high surface area to volume ratio. And those thin fungi, because they're so thin, they're able to get access to nutrients in the soil that plants can't get to. So being so thin gives them access to things like phosphorus and nitrogen especially. So these two important nutrients for plant growth that the plant roots would not have access to on their own. And so how does each partner benefit in this mutualism? So remember, both partners benefit in a mutualism. So the way this works is the plant, because it's doing photosynthesis, can send sugars down to the roots, and some of those sugars can go to the fungus. So the fungus gets photosynthate sugars from the plant, and in turn, the plant gets more phosphorus and nitrogen from the fungus, because the fungus, because it's thinner, has a higher surface area to volume ratio, can get access to some of this phosphorus and nitrogen that the plant wouldn't have access to on its own. So the plant gives sugars, and in return, the fungus gives nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus to the plant. And as it turns out, plants greatly benefit by being in this mycorrhizal relationship. So if you look at plant growth with normal, so these are plants grown with normal mycorrhizal fungi, and these are the same plants grown without these normal mycorrhizal fungi. What you can see is plants grown with those mycorrhizal fungi can grow much larger, and that's because they're getting access to more of those limiting nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. And so the plant doesn't die if it doesn't have the mycorrhizal fungi, but it doesn't grow as well because it's not getting access to as many nutrients. Other adaptations that we can talk about, interesting adaptations that plants have to increase nutrient uptake other than mycorrhizal fungi. We see examples in nature of several types of carnivorous plants. So a Venus flytrap, or this pitcher plant that you see right here. So this Venus flytrap, it'll trap a fly in it and dissolve that fly, or these pitcher plants will trap crickets and other insects in them and dissolve those crickets. And typically, we see these carnivorous plants evolving in low nitrogen or phosphorus soils. So low nitrogen and phosphorus is where we most commonly see Venus flytraps in these pitcher plants, so like swampy areas. And the reason for that is because they get nitrogen and phosphorus from eating the flies or dissolving the crickets. Okay, so the reason these plants have evolved this trait is to acquire nitrogen and phosphorus because they're not able to get it from the soils. And so an important point to sort of drive home here is that although these plants are consuming another organism to get that nitrogen and phosphorus and these other sort of essential nutrients, these plants are still considered to be photoautotrophs. So you can see, for example, this Venus flytrap, it's green. It still does photosynthesis, and it still gets its carbon-to-carbon bonds and its sugar and its energy from light. So it gets its sugar and its energy from light, so it's autotrophic, and it gets its carbon-to-carbon bonds from CO2, so from an inorganic source. So it's getting nitrogen and phosphorus from these other things. And so these plants are still actually considered to be photoautotrophs, despite the fact that they're eating these other organisms. And that's because they're eating those other organisms not for carbon, but for nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay, which of the following is true regarding nutrient uptake in plants? If you said B, that is the correct answer. So plants typically collect important minerals like nitrogen and phosphorus through their leaves and shoot systems. That is false. So the leaf and shoot systems collect CO2 and light. It's the roots that collect important minerals like nitrogen and phosphorus. Carnivorous plants like Venus flytraps are typically found in low light environments because consuming insects helps them increase their sugar intake. So we just discussed this. This is false. Having those flytraps is all about collecting more nitrogen and phosphorus. They're still photosynthetic, so they can still make their own sugar. Plants can form a mutualism with mycorrhizal fungi, which increases the plant's ability to uptake sugars from the soil. This is a false statement. Having that mutualistic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi is all about getting access to things like phosphorus and nitrogen. Okay, so this is all the information we've covered up to this point. We've added on these two new points now, that having a high surface area to volume ratio root system selectively collects water and minerals and delivers it to the shoot systems via the xylem. And we've also talked about other adaptations for nutrient uptake like mycorrhizal fungi and the evolution of carnivorous plants to get nitrogen and phosphorus. And so what we'll talk about next is plant growth and Liebig's law of the minimum.